Have you ever wondered how racial trauma and emotional intelligence tie in together? You might also be wondering what this has to do with DEI. That illustrates the many facets of DEI and how to bridge the gap to emotional intelligence. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation has you buzzing for more. I am looking forward to you meeting my co host. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat and on social media. We intend to respond to as many questions and comments from our audience as possible. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off, and we are eternally grateful to all of our loyal guests. Follow us on Diversity Connects Us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcast. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and my business partner and co-host is Dr. Rudell. We are both DEI consultants. As an EQ coach and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my book, I share strategies and practical examples of EQ. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. For a living, we help organizations implement DEI plans with an emotional intelligence framework and to help reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking webinars and workshops. Join us as we share the different voices in the DEI space. Here today with us is Dr. Rudell. Hello, and how are you?
I am well. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you for asking. I would love you to introduce yourself in your unique way to the audience.
Absolutely. So, my name is Enan Rudell, and I have spent the better part of the last 20 years studying the human condition and some of the factors that often hinder us from functioning optimally across life domains. I did that for many years as a human service worker and then eventually a therapist before working in the space of organizational psychology, which is how I come to you today.
And much of your research has been rooted in emotional intelligence.
Mhm. Yes, I have been studying in the space of emotional intelligence now for just over 5 years, as I began to view emotional intelligence as a tool for helping to navigate social interaction.
And what has been the working definition, you think, of emotional intelligence that you have used to frame your research?
So I'm actually going to go ahead. I have my notes here. This has been the working definition that I've used. So emotional intelligence I've defined as the ability to identify and manage one's own emotions as well as the emotions of others. Emotional intelligence is generally said to include at least three skills: emotional awareness, or the ability to identify and name one's own emotions, the ability to harness those emotions and apply them to tasks like thinking and problem solving, and lastly, the ability to manage one's own emotions, which can include both regulating one's emotions when necessary and or helping others do the same. And there are three sort of primary skills I'd want to highlight here. And that's that emotional intelligence is generally said to include emotional awareness, the ability to identify and name one's own emotions, and the ability to harness those emotions and apply them to tasks like thinking and problem solving.
Right. It's it's clear that it must involve a sense of being in the moment to be able to access that information, to be able to apply it. I have to say, it takes a great deal of effort, especially on my part, given the fact that I already know my my flaws, if you will, and I know there's always room for improvement. And I think what's important for me is being in the moment, as opposed to letting the emotion take over you. Then you absolutely have no control of what you're going to say thereafter.
Yeah, and so you touched on something really important, the idea that emotional intelligence really is based upon one's ability to be in tune and aware and fully present with what is surfacing for you in that moment, and that could be mentally and or emotionally. But I tend to boil emotional intelligence down to one word, and that really is awareness and being aware. So at any given moment, how are we experiencing that interaction, or how are we experiencing the world around us?
Right. And to storytell a little bit, to share a personal experience. Um, my daughter, who's in school, she's 8, and I'm a mother lion and protective. If anything is said or done to her, or I always demand that others respect her. So there was something simple that went on between the teacher and her, and I took it to heart, and I had many emotions occurring at the time. And then I realized that at that moment, it wasn't a good time to to schedule an interview with the teacher. So I called her dad, and he had to put it in perspective for me, but I had to wait until all those emotions subsided, which took about 2, 3 days. And then once it subsided, I was able to put things more into perspective. And then I made a call to him and I said, look, this is what's going on. How do I handle it? And he was able to de escalate the way I was feeling. 'Cause I'm like, I'm her mom. I'm a lion. I'm protective. And by the time I spoke to him, it was, well, Rochelle, this is the language you need to use. And I thought, oh, so what's the language I need to use? And he goes, we, us, how can we help Sophia to get to point A? And I realized that language was a unifying language. And when I went to see the teacher, I mean, it would have been a complete disaster if I had seen him, because I was ready to confront.
Yeah.
And 3 days later, he was very receptive, and he spoke openly about the cultural differences between him as a teacher from another country, and then the majority of the children, which are Caribbean, and they're huggers, and you know and so he was explaining how he himself is adjusting to the culture. And this is what he's doing as well. He's meeting the kids halfway and learning how to interact with them. But if I had taken that other approach, where I was completely emotional and erratic about my daughter — everybody has a daughter, who feels, probably, or a child who feels that way — it would have been a completely different situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, thank you, first of all, for sharing that. That's such a powerful narrative when we think of the use of emotional intelligence. So if we go back to, there was something that triggered you and you wanted to respond, but then it sounds like you were able to sort of check in with yourself, and sometimes we do need support from others, and it sounds like her father was that for you in that instance, was able to sort of help you understand that in that context, maybe it's that you weren't your best self, or maybe it's that you needed a moment or two to just sort of pause, breathe, reframe your thinking around the situation before then proceeding from there, right? So you just highlighted the definition that I laid out for emotional intelligence, word for word, and I think providing a really powerful example of what it can look like for us on the day to day.
Right. And when we think of emotional intelligence concerning racial trauma, how does the use of EQ surface in the Black community?
So, what comes to mind for me, I'll use myself as an example. So, there was a term that I learned. This was a few years ago when I was doing some research for my dissertation. The term was called two-ness, right? So it's to give you an example. I'm an American, but I am a Black American, right? So at any given point, we all have these multiple identities because it doesn't even need to stop at two. The term is called two-ness, but we might have multiple identities even outside of the scope of how two-ness is defined. So at any given point, it's understanding for me in moments when I've been triggered, um, having to sort of take a step back and understand at the end of the day, I'm a 6'1" bald Black male, right? So there are a unique set of circumstances attached to if I get upset versus if my counterpart who may not be of color gets upset. It is likely to be experienced differently and therefore framed differently.
And perceived differently.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's one of these things where I think when we think of racial trauma and we think of our history of Black people in this country and how important it is for us to not only understand our history, but to understand where we're at in this moment in time and how our identity shows up for us. It could be how it shows up for us in a work context or just in a social context in general. There's a lot there that at any given moment we're trying to manage. So for me, when I walk in a room, oftentimes I'm trying to manage how I think I'm being perceived by others because of how I identify. So there's that mixed with how I view myself. And so at times it feels like by the time, let's say in a work context, I can never just focus on my role. By the
Mm.
time I'm able to just focus on my role, if we think of our energy on a scale of 0 to 100, at any given moment, I've spent 60% of my energy on sort of my mental and cognitive framing of the experience, so that by the time I make it to my job, by the time I make it to my actual role, it makes it really hard to bring 100% when I've already used so much on, am I dressed okay? Was I on time? How do I sound? Did I make my points in such a way where I sound articulate? There's all of this sort of stuff that for myself and for our community as a whole, that we're having to filter before we can actually get to our authentic sort of self in that role, in the context of that role.
Right. S- So, what I'm hearing is that you've actually used emotional intelligent components or pillars to be able to assess the situation, because that's self-awareness, so self-awareness within yourself. And
Mhm.
then there's social awareness as to how everybody else is feeling. And then now you're managing those relationships based on social awareness and self-awareness. So now you're managing. So this is emotional intelligence for a Black male. So you've clearly laid it all out from the morning you woke up until
Mhm.
you've left your home and until you've gotten to your corporate space.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll take it a step further, and maybe this is just my belief, but Black people in this country, like we cannot afford to not understand the value of emotional intelligence. For us, it's something that I believe is ingrained in us. Like we have to, at any given moment, we have to understand how we're being perceived, what we represent when we walk in a room, and the consequences that are attached to that if we're going to navigate whatever the situation is effectively. And
Right.
so there's a lot there.
Right. How important do you think it is to make space to talk about mental health in the Black community?
Critical. I feel like it's imperative, and for too long, for far too long, we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't talk about it. We couldn't acknowledge it. Society would say to me, as a male, particularly as a Black man, that I am supposed to be not just strong, but almost like devoid of emotion. So something like crying, is something that, I'm not supposed to know what that's like. I'm not supposed to have ever experienced that. And I mean, though it's unfortunate what it took for us to get to where we're at as a society, I'm grateful on some level that we're here where we can talk about our mental health. A few weeks back, I facilitated a panel discussion at a church for Black men and awareness of mental health, and it ended up being one of the most, you know, beautiful experiences that I've ever experienced. Where we have this room where I think we had 25 Black men, which, to hear the church tell it, was the first time that they'd ever been able to pull that many brothers together on a Saturday voluntarily,
Mm,
where we could have this open dialogue. And one of the things that I found was, though I'm sitting at this table for panelists, I'm learning from them just the same. And it ended up being just this beautiful mutual exchange around our experiences as Black men in mental health. So, I feel like now more than ever, it is critical that we make space to talk about these things. We are not robots, nor should we conduct ourselves as such. There's actually data to support. One of the reasons why men in general, not generally speaking, men typically don't live as long. We hold so much in. So now think about just that raw data point. Now add the complexity of race on top of that, and as Black men, all that we've been going through historically, but particularly in recent times, you know without that outlet, we run the risk. I mean, this is how we see some of the health conditions in the community that we see, right? Our blood pressure, not knowing how to manage feelings of depression or anxiety or stress, um, can sometimes actually open the door to these other habits that aren't helpful, right? So now we're talking about self-medicating, and for some, that can be alcohol, it can be drugs, it can be whatever it is. So I think it's really important that we have these conversations and that we understand that it's okay to feel how we feel. I'll offer up a story to you. This is when I was 12. When I was growing up, I played a lot of sports, basketball, football, and track. And I remember coming home from a game. Actually, no, this was practice. Now I'm 12 years old. I'm in my football gear. And I had injured another player on a play inadvertently. And I remember all of these fathers, they happened to all be white, storming the field and getting in my face. And my father was off to the side. I don't think he saw everything that happened. When I got to the car with like my helmet in hand, I get in the car and I remember my dad, love my dad to death, right? But I remember my dad, who's an old school Caribbean guy, looking at me as I'm in the passenger seat. And he's like, stop crying. Stop crying. Man up. And inadvertently, the message was delivered to me at that time. It's not okay to express emotion. And it would be a few years. I had to go through my own sort of stages of adult development before I began to understand. Again, my dad meant well, and it's nothing against him, but I think it speaks to a larger narrative, around expressing emotion. So I just think mental health is important, which is why I gave so many years working as a therapist. And I'm not practicing as one right now, only because I needed to step away. One of the things that I found, I'll give you a little context. I was the first Black male in this clinic's 50-year history. I was the first full-time Black male. This was a department of psychiatry in a large hospital setting. So I saw an average of, I was 297 patients every 2.5 months for 4 years. So I got to a place where I started to realize I was a little burned out. So I've opted to sort of sit on the sideline a little bit. And I'll return one day because I can feel the need for it. And truth be told, it's what I love. But yeah, I just think it's really important that we talk about it.
Right. And I think mental health has been a stigma and a taboo for many years. And I think it's really difficult to be able to step out and unwind the narrative, for me was we don't talk, we don't air our dirty laundry.
Yeah.
And that's how I knew not to say one thing, not even to the therapist.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So,
Yeah.
although it was encouraged to seek
Mhm.
therapy,
Mhm.
but the purpose to go to therapy is to talk about what is really going on at home. So I
Yeah.
think as a society, as a nation, I think there has to be more global awareness in talking about it openly
Mhm.
and 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 finding a safe space to be able to address mental wellness.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm recalling the panel discussion that I referenced a moment ago, and I dropped the word therapy, and it was like crickets. It was like crickets. It was like a sea of Black men, and I could see them kind of like, readjusting themselves in their
Right.
seats and whatever. So I finally sort of doubled down on that as a potential resource and asked what people's experience was. And as it turns out, people had experiences with it. They just didn't want to talk. Like it was the first time that they'd ever publicly acknowledged it in front of other men. And so it
Mm.
led to this beautiful exchange of one guy in the back, God bless him, because he puts his hand up and he's kind of like, yeah, I went to therapy once, and this was my experience with it. Then before you realize it, guy over here puts his hand up. Yeah, yeah, man. I also went, and so then it sort of like helped to normalize the conversation. But when I first dropped the word, you would think I cursed in church.
Absolutely. You did curse in church.
You know what I mean? I felt bad about myself. I'm like, wow, but yeah. I mean, I think it's really important. And I'm glad to see more of us talking about it
Mm,
and owning our mental health.
absolutely. Because I think in owning your mental health, that's how you can show up authentically at work.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
And can you speak to some of the stigmas
Yeah.
I know often associated with mental health, particularly for Black men?
Yeah. I mean, um, it's viewed as a deficiency,
Mm,
or it can be viewed as a weakness. So you mentioned that you have to go, or that you've sought therapy, and unfortunately it's common for people to look at you and be like, well, what's wrong with you? Why do you need this? you know um and so I definitely think that there was a stigma around it. And I think that we've made great strides as a community as a whole to sort of challenge that perception. It's still there,
mm,
but I don't. I'm feeling like it's not quite as strong. I think therapy and mental health support in general, because it doesn't have to be individual, but also be like men's support groups, um, you
Mm.
know, kind of thing. I feel like resources in general are a little more accepted now than they once were. That stigma was strong. I mentioned my father. My father's a Martinican descent. I can say to you that for the time period that my dad was actually a young adult, I don't think therapy really even existed in Martinique, right? For example, and in different sort of pockets of our society, it was something that was sort of looked down on because it's like, why would you go tell this stranger the family business? Like
That's
you better not talk, you know?
that's exactly it. I think it probably also stems from racial trauma and generational trauma that's been passed down so that others can view us in the best light possible.
Yeah.
And viewing us in the best light possible is by not having a mental disability or a mental deficiency, or not being well mentally, meant that someone's going to view you differently. And in
Mhm.
order for us as Caribbeans or Afro Caribbeans or Africans to be able to assimilate or integrate, we have to be normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And think of the stress though that puts on us psychologically to always have to put up appearances. Like
Right.
I find it liberating where now I could say, if my mood is off, I'll say it. I'll say it, man. And I encourage and I invite others to do the same because simply stated, it's just not healthy on a physiological level to have to hold all of that in. And there's a disproportionate sort of like there's a pressure, and I think this speaks to the stigma that you're asking about in our community. Whereas therapy was an acceptable coping strategy in other communities, and while it was thriving in other communities, particularly in our community, it's something that was frowned upon long after it was accepted in other pockets, and there's reasons for that, right? But I think now, hopefully we've turned the corner.
Hmm.
You know, yeah.
I had a therapist on our show last year, Dr. Aku,
Mm,
and the audience that we were getting feedback from were from Black males. And after having her on the show, I realized that the reason why they came to actually speak freely on social media was because of the racial connection.
yeah.
And she identified as African American, and it was the gap was already very small in
Mm,
terms of a connection. So I think once we seek, a mental therapist, psychologist, or a psychiatrist, whatever type of therapist that it is, it's really important to find someone who already can identify with the issues and the traumas that generations before us have gone through, so that it bridges the gap so you don't have to tell the story to
yeah.
someone who cannot relate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I unfortunately I felt that during my time as a therapist. Like people would show up for an appointment and they would say, you know, we were waitlisted for 6 months, before we could get to you because, unfortunately, in my case, a Black male therapist at the time that I was practicing was like needle in a haystack. And so what I ended up representing was a safe space for a whole lot of people that wouldn't consider therapy otherwise. I remember even when I stopped practicing, and at the time that I stopped, truth be told, I stopped because I was a little burnt out, but I was also going through the doc program. I was pursuing my doctorate in organizational psychology. And I remember feeling really guilty that there was no
Mm,
one I can refer these clients to that looked like them, because for them, it understandably it mattered,
mm,
you know? And so I have no idea who followed up with whomever I connected them to, and who didn't. Um, but I remember just feeling like this weight
mm.
on my shoulder, during that time period, you know? Yeah. Hmm.
What what would be your takeaway today for the audience?
I would say I would say to reflect on emotional intelligence as a concept and as a coping strategy. How does it show up for you in your day to day? Are there ways that you can leverage emotional intelligence to help navigate difficult situations? And I would add to that, um, because oftentimes I think we practice emotional intelligence, but we don't, like, I was practicing it long before I knew the term. So maybe what I'll do is take a step back and I'll say to reflect on what is surfacing for you in that moment. What are you feeling? Could you benefit from sitting for a minute or two before reacting? What is it that you need to react as your best self? Because far too often, we keep it bottled up, and it boils over the top, and then we lash out, right? Um, so I would say, just I would encourage some real reflection around what's going on in the moment.
It's been a great conversation, absolutely. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank you for listening. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We will share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes and confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag diversity connects us. We're still live. Oh, okay. Oh, we're still live. Let's see. We're having technical difficulties and I cannot end the broadcast.